Welcome back for the second lecture in our series on how to think like an economist. If you recall, in the last lecture we talked about 6 foundation principles, fundamental premises that all economists accept about humans and their social interactions. The first, of course, was that people respond to their incentives. The second was that in a world of scarcity, there is no free lunch. There's always going to be an opportunity cost to be paid. The third was that you can never do just one thing. Every interaction has at least 2 sides. The fourth was that everything is interconnected. There can be unanticipated influences. The fifth was that actions are going to have unintended consequences. And the last was that no one is ever truly in control. Together, these define the boundaries of the world in which economists live. Thinking, deciding, acting like an economist means starting with that foundation. Today, we're going to complete the basic economist toolkit by developing 3 core analytic concepts: rationality, marginal analysis, and optimization, that we sometimes also call constrained maximization. If you were to do a word search on a substantive economic article, I would expect the 3 most commonly recurring terms would be rational, marginal, and optimal. Economists throw those words around like teenagers throw around the word like. A working understanding of these 3 concepts and how economists use them is the goal for getting us through the lecture today. And then we're going to be equipped to talk about any issue and think like an economist about it. First of all, economists believe in rationality. They build extraordinarily complex models on the assumption that humans are fundamentally rational in their behavior. That means that they're going to choose strategically rather than randomly. They may sometimes stray, but strategic rationality is a strong working approximation of human behavior. But it's important to remember that economists' concept of rationality is much narrower than that of philosophers. We make no judgments about the wisdom of your final objectives. We make no judgments about the goals. Each person gets to decide what he or she really wants. What economists concern themselves with is the decision processes that people use when they're trying to obtain those objectives. Economic rationality refers to the process of decision making, not to its objective. People can rationally pursue ends that to others seem absolutely absurd. Every winter where we live, we drive past a frozen oxbow lake along the Connecticut River. It's often covered with fishermen, even on the coldest of days. They're sitting on stools, exposed out on the ice. There they sit, staring into a hole in the ice at a monofilament line for hours on end. My wife, who grew up in Arizona and has not been truly warm since we moved to New England, thinks they are crazy. What rational person would ever choose to do that, she asks. As an economist, I have to say, any person who, for whatever reason, derives real pleasure from the experience should do that. If for whatever incomprehensible reason it brings them pleasure, it would be irrational for them not to be sitting there. For my wife, however, it would be absurd and irrational. Both the fisherman and my wife can make rational choices. What differs for them is their personal assessment of the experience. It's how we decide, not what we decide, that marks rationality in the economist view of the world. This can go to extraordinary extremes. If you were a true believer as a suicide bomber, and you thought that God's will really required that you commit this unspeakable act, if you thought it would really bring immeasurable and eternal rewards in paradise, it could be rational in the economist's use of the term to push that detonator button. To me, as a human, that would be tragically mistaken, unquestionably immoral and unspeakably evil. But it would not, in formal terms, be irrational. In principle, then, making rational decisions is easy. Just follow 4 simple steps. First, clarify the objective or the goal. Economic thinking, as I've said, is not much help here. It's going to be more helpful when we go to the second and third and fourth steps. The second stage in making a rational decision, once you know the objective, is to identify all possible alternative paths to help you get there. If you don't know your options, it's hard to systematically choose the best one. The third step is then to evaluate carefully the payoffs from each of those alternatives. And that's where economic thinking can help a lot. And we're going to develop some tools through the course of these lectures that will help you with understanding how to put some value on some difficult things. And then finally, you have to actually, of course, select the best one and implement your decision. To determine the best course and then willfully choose another one would be to act irrationally. And economists don't like it when people do that. You remember that in our world of scarcity, the world of the six principles, evaluating opportunities or alternatives is all about valuing the opportunity costs. What is not chosen is the real cost of what you do choose. The cost of any choice is really the value of what you gave up, the choice that was not taken. So, for rationality says that you should always choose the option with the highest net payoff. To knowingly choose anything worse would be irrational. Now again, in teenagers' language, that would be kind of a duh conclusion. But it's a very powerful and very valuable predictor of behavior, that concept of rationality. Now, the presumption of rationality works two ways, of course. It helps us with the prediction and the description of behavior, but it also gives us a way to evaluate ex post, after the fact, to draw some conclusions about values. So if I observe you choosing one alternative over another, and believing as I do in rationality, I think you have thereby revealed to me your true preference. I know what you value. I may not agree with your preference. That doesn't matter. Clearly, you valued it. You valued the chosen alternative over the other options. Thus, because I perceive the world in rationality terms, I know that those ice fishermen value the afternoon on the frozen lake more highly than any other option. They could have spent the afternoon under a cozy quilt sipping herbal tea, but they freely chose instead to sit out there on that frozen lake. That proves to me that it was, in their evaluation, the best attainable alternative. For them, that was a rational choice. For my wife to make that choice would be unimaginably insane, and I have every confidence in the world she will never do that. This concept of strategic decision-making and rationality as both an objective for and a description of human behavior is fundamental to economic thinking. It's the first of our core concepts. Now, I'm going to tell you flat out, economists are marginal thinkers. But that doesn't mean what you think it means. That's not a comment about the quality of their thought. It's a comment about the focus of their thought. Economists tend to look carefully at sequences of small changes made on the margin, because most of the choices we make in life are not all or nothing decisions. Most of them are how many more or how much less decisions. In opportunity cost terms, most of our choices involve marginal trade-offs. A little more of this inevitably means a little bit less of that. I recently saw a bumper sticker, and you're going to be struck through the course that I often seem to find economic principles in bumper stickers and letters to the editor and other strange places, but I guess that's a mark of thinking like an economist. The bumper sticker I saw said, "Housing is a right, not a privilege." The empathetic human in me said, "How true, how true." But the economist in me said, that bumper sticker makes no sense. Why not? It doesn't make sense until we specify how much housing each of us has a right to. Do we have a right to a refrigerator box? To a 1,000 square foot bungalow? To a 20,000 square foot mansion with a pool and a tennis court? How much health care or education or Caribbean vacations must be foregone to provide it? What would be the opportunity cost? When does having a little more housing reach the line of meeting the right? When is it enough? And when does it cross the line into too much? In a moment, we'll talk about those principles somewhat. But first I want to have fun with a little puzzle that's solvable by marginal thinking. So watch closely as I do this, because you can amaze your friends and you'll be able to illustrate the fundamental process of marginal analysis. So imagine with me. You have a salt shaker, you have a pepper shaker. For reasons that totally escape me, you decide that you're going to dip a teaspoon into the pepper shaker, take it over, dump it in the salt shaker, put the lid on, and shake it up. So now I've got a teaspoon of pepper in with a mostly salt. Now, I don't know why I want to do this, but suppose now I take the same teaspoon, I dip it into the one that has a lot of salt and a little bit of pepper. I come over, I dump it into the pepper shaker and shake that one up. Now here's the puzzle. After I'm done, is there more pepper in the salt shaker or more salt in the pepper shaker? It sounds tricky, doesn't it? But the answer is simple. The answer is no. There's not more in either one. With marginal analysis, I think it's going to be easy to see that the amount of the added spice is going to be exactly the same in both situations. And the key to doing that is not to focus on the shakers, but to focus on the teaspoons. Follow the sequence of changes in order to understand the effects on the total. So watch the first move. Here's the teaspoon. It's going into the pepper, it's coming out, and there's 1 teaspoon of pepper in it, and that's the amount that I dump into the salt. That was easy. Now it gets more interesting. The second time I do this, and I dip the teaspoon in, it's going to come out mostly salt mixed with a little bit of pepper. How much? 1/4 teaspoon, 1/16, 1/234th? I have no idea. But let's call it X teaspoons of pepper. So X teaspoons of pepper have come out of the salt shaker. How much is left? Well, 1 minus X. Now watch the spoon as it's moving toward the other shaker. If X teaspoon is the amount of pepper that's in this teaspoon, how much salt must be in it? The answer, of course, is 1 minus X. It's mostly salt, but it also contains X teaspoons. And when I add that over here, each container ends up with exactly 1 minus X teaspoons of the other, no matter what the value of X. By focusing our attention on a sequence of changes, the outcome for the whole becomes crystal clear. We solved this using marginal analysis. The end result for the total is always determined by the changes on the margin. Marginal analysis is key to many economic insights. This can be applied in many contexts. For example, I know you've all seen this during a campaign. There's a TV screen, there's an evil-looking mugshot of a convicted violent criminal, and a voiceover says, "Last year, crime cost our city $500 million. Yet the incumbent mayor budgeted a mere $75 million for the police." Now, what's the implication? Obviously, the mayor is spending far too little on crime. Or is he? An economist will say that statement tells us nothing of value. Yes, it's true. The total cost of crime, $500 million, is greater than the amount spent to fight crime, $75 million. But those numbers measure what's happening in the shakers. The wisdom of increasing the police budget depends on the teaspoons, on the changes, not on the shakers, which are just the current totals. Think like an economist for a moment about the statement that was in that television ad. Yes, the total costs of crime are $575 million. 500 direct crime costs, 75 million prevention costs. But a change is justified only if it reduces that total. And you evaluate that by looking at the teaspoons, at the changes, at the effects on the total of increasing or decreasing the amount that's budgeted. If a marginal, an additional $1 million is spent for the police, but it reduces crime by a mere $100,000, then the marginal gain, the teaspoon, is less than the marginal cost, and the total cost of crime is actually increasing, not decreasing. Only if an additional spending is going to reduce the total cost of crime by more than $1 million, $2.5 million, say, then the expenditure would make sense. The key point from this is the wisdom of any change in policy or any change in behavior can only be determined by looking at its net impacts on the margin. Comparing totals tells you very little indeed. Understand that, and you're thinking like an economist. Now, there's one more important aspect. The marginal value of anything is not fixed. It changes as we have more or less of it. Ever since economists became marginal thinkers in the 19th century, that postulate has given them answers to problems that had confounded classical economists for generations. One of those puzzles was what was called the water diamond paradox. And the question was, why would rational people pay so much for something so unnecessary like a diamond? And why would people willingly sell so cheaply something that should be so very dear, without which life is impossible, water? With marginal analysis, the way out of this conundrum was obvious, because they shifted attention from the salt shakers to the teaspoons. It's never how much water is worth in the abstract, it's always how much is one more pint of water worth. And of course, that depends on how much you already have. We've all seen the cliche cartoon. There's a traveler crawling across the harsh desert. There are impatient vultures circling overhead. He's completely without water, and life itself is in the balance. And if I ask you what would be the increase in his welfare from the first pint of water, and the answer is that would be incalculable. The single pint, that marginal pint, would easily be worth a whole bag of diamonds to that thirst-stricken traveler at that moment. The second would be almost as valuable. But at some point, the gain from one more marginal pint of water becomes less and less, and we say that diminishing returns on the margin have set in. Additional pints are still adding to welfare. They're just not adding as much as they did before. Welfare is rising at a decreasing rate. It's up, but by less and less. The marginal value can become negative. If there was a thunderstorm and a desert flash flood, the traveler would be better off with less water. But the point is that value is always marginal and always situational. It's hard to grasp, but it's an important and powerful concept. We can apply it in lots of different contexts. So, for example, if you're a runner and you make a commitment, your resolution that you're going to shave 30 seconds off your time for the mile, how expensive that's going to be probably depends on what your personal best currently is. It'd probably take less effort to get a 30-second improvement if your best time is 20 minutes. It'll take quite a bit more if your best time is 7 minutes. And the cost of achieving that may be infinite and impossible if it's 5 minutes. The marginal cost of a 30-second improvement increases as the current record is lowered. Total time keeps falling, but the marginal cost of achieving each improvement keeps rising. Let's have a pop quiz. One of the courses I teach is an urban economics course. Not long ago, I asked some students a question. I want to see how you would answer it. The question was, if we woke up tomorrow and gas prices in the U.S. had doubled, how would that affect automobile usage? One student started with an assertion, said, at that price, no one would ever drive their car. That's a bad start for an economics class. Not that good a start for an English class, since no one is singular and there is plural, but I'm going to overlook that for a moment. Because the question about driving is, it's not an all or nothing decision. It's a more or less decision, and how much more and how much less. At high gas prices, some trips on the margin would not be worth it, but others certainly still would be. And thinking like an economist means we always reject claims that say that a change in price is going to make things stop altogether. You know that even if most people did stop driving, that would mean the freeways would be empty, there'd be easy parking everywhere, and surely that should be enough to cover the pain at the pump for some drivers, some of the time. Some level of driving still makes sense. It'll be less, but it won't be zero. People adjust on the margin until the value of the last trip taken reflects the new higher costs of driving. So that's two of our principles, our core concepts that we want to talk about today. The third one is about optimization and something called the equimarginal principle. But before going on to the third concept, let's just summarize where we are for a moment. We're economists, so we're thinking about things on the margin. We're looking at strategically rational decisions. We're talking about scarcity and trade-offs, opportunity cost. More of one thing, less of another. And as the marginal value changes, more of something makes the marginal value fall, less of something makes the marginal value rise. So given this, what's the best attainable allocation, the best balance, the best optimal outcome, the maximum achievable given the constraints? Can you use these principles we've devised to optimize? And the answer is yes, by using something that economists call the equimarginal principle. And that's the last of our three core concepts. So I want to approach this doing a thought experiment. And I'm going to bet that intuitively you're going to apply the equimarginal principle. Unselfconsciously, you're going to end up at the optimal solution, but without really resorting to all the fancy mathematics we use to determine optimum points in economic model. So here we are. Imagine yourself on a new TV reality show. You come with just the clothes on your back. You're flown by a helicopter deep into the wilderness. You're given a special number of chits that you get to exchange at a special trading post. 4 items that are going to aid in your survival. Each chit can buy 1 unit of food or 1 unit of shelter. Now, the host, before he's flown back to his comfortable and very well-stocked trailer, is going to voice over, "Welcome to wilderness camp. Winter's on the way, and you have nothing. You must choose wisely how to spend your chits. Choose unwisely, and you may not survive until spring. You must now decide whether food or shelter is the best choice." Then he gets on his helicopter, he flies away. But if you think like an economist, or really any rational human being, I'm sure you're going to just immediately reject this fundamental premise. Survival, and I think survival is part of an optimal outcome, survival is not about either food or shelter. It's about the best attainable combination of the two. And what exactly is best? To gorge on food while freezing to death is not a good strategy. Basking in warmth and comfort while starving to death, not a good strategy either. The optimal is to find the balance between food and shelter that, of course, will bring the marginal value of each of them to be equal. Hence the name, the equimarginal principle. The contribution on the margin is the same for each. So let's work this through a little bit. So just consider, foolishly, you've decided to spend all of your chits on shelter and none for food. So you've got lots of shelter, no food. That last unit of shelter, it's probably nice, but the marginal value, the addition that it added to your welfare is very low indeed. You're pretty well sheltered, but you're facing starvation. The first meal, because you have no food, would have a very high marginal value. The meal foregone is the opportunity cost of the last bit of shelter, and it's much higher than the benefit. That was an irrational choice. Every time you trade off 1 less shelter for 1 more food, there's a huge net gain. And you should make that trade in that situation. It will be rational. But it's not always rational to trade shelter for food. Why not? Suppose you started instead with all food and no shelter. Then because you had so much food, the marginal value of food would be low and the marginal value of shelter would be high. In that situation, rationality would say, trade food, which you have a lot of, for shelter. But no matter which end of this bargain you start with, as you give up more and more of the abundant good, its marginal value, though starting low, is ever rising. As you acquire more and more of the scarce good, its marginal value, though starting high, will be ever falling. And when they meet, when they are equal, you've arrived at the optimum combination. You cannot gain even the tiniest amount by trading one for the other. You're at the pinnacle. You've maximized subject to the constraint. You've gotten as much welfare as possible from the allocation you were given. You've optimized. And you've done it subconsciously by applying the equimarginal principle. There you have it. Apply the concepts of rationality, marginality and constrained optimization in a world prescribed by the 6 foundation principles, and you're thinking like an economist. We can dress this all up in fancy mathematics. We often do. We can use complex econometric models to test empirically hypotheses about the parameters of the functions in the real world. We often do. But the real essence of learning to think like an economist is to be comfortable with this basic toolkit. After we add efficiency next time, you'll have it all. But we have a few minutes left. So what I'd like to do is just talk about a couple of these principles in a couple of interesting contexts and think like economists about what would be a rational response to incentives in the following real-world situations. Back in the days of the old Soviet Union, they were very concerned about their world image. And one of the things they did in order to incentivize their athletes was to pay them a cash bonus anytime one of them set a new world record, even if they were breaking their own world record. Now, think with me for a moment about what kind of incentives that created. Now, I'm absolutely sure that their athletes were extremely competitive, but I think they were probably responding rationally to that particular bonus that was going to be available. Athletes would want to break any world record they possibly could, but perhaps they had an incentive to break it by as little as possible so it would be easier to break again. Sergei Bubka set the pole vault record for the first time in 1983. Over the next decade, he broke his own outdoor record 16 times and his own indoor record 17 times. And he often broke it by the merest of margins, a centimeter or less, and then he would quit for the day. Instead of pushing to see how high he could make it, he was satisfied to have broken the record. His incentive, apparently, was not to set the record as high as he possibly could on any given day, but to set it as often as he could. I think an economist would predict that if the size of the bonus had been dependent on the size of the increase in the record height, the history of modern pole vaulting might have been quite different. No one who's read both Charles Dickens and Ernest Hemingway will ever confuse one with the other. As artists, their styles were reflections of themselves and reflections of the times in which they wrote. And perhaps also in some small measure at least, they were a reflection of the way in which they were paid. Most of Dickens' novels were serialized, usually in about 20 parts. And he would receive a contract payment every time he filled up 32 pages of printed text. He wasn't exactly paid by the word, but wordiness certainly helped him to stretch his stories out to the full contracted length. Now, Hemingway, of course, got paid by the completed manuscript. There was no financial incentive for him to modify his sparse style of writing. If Hemingway and Dickens had been paid by identical formula, you still would have been able to tell them apart. Their styles would have been different. They would have been distinct. But it doesn't mean that their compensation formula had no impact at all on their writing. So what does this all mean for you? What do you want to take away from this? It means that whether you're writing a book like Hemingway and Dickens, whether you're striving to set a world record like Sergei Bubka, whether you're looking at the compensation formula for your employees, considering how your financial advisor's paid, or examining the terms of a seasonal contract with your snowplower, thinking like an economist means being ever cognizant of the incentives you face, and perhaps more importantly, the incentives those around you face. It means anticipating what's strategically rational for them and how that will affect your options. It means focusing on the margin, on trade-offs, and on adjustments to find the optimal balance. The question is always going to be, how much of which? Next time, we're going to step back just a bit and widen our economic perspective to consider one last concept, the concept of economic efficiency. What is it that economists mean when they use that term? How does it relate to rationality? How does it fit into this paradigm that defines economic thinking? When lots of us as individuals respond strategically to the incentives we personally face, can we be certain that the outcome will be socially efficient? Economists as economists Think about that a lot. Next time, so will we.